everybody.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You sound very chipper. I'm impressed. I don't know if I had that much energy for my 10 o'clock classes in undergrad. Okay, and we'll have to see. We might be a little lighter on people today because some people may not be attending because it's Labor Day. So, but I want to go ahead and again respect your time. So I'll start chatting about things that are upcoming for us. So I just sent you an email a couple minutes ago, and I'm going to screen share Blackboard to show you what I did here. So typically when I teach my, the day we have on Wednesday, the assessment discussion activity day, I have you all fill out the psychological inventories in class. And I feel like doing it remotely, that'll just be really clunky. So you don't have any reading for Wednesday, but go ahead and fill out these psychological inventories before class on Wednesday. Stick this in it. And hang on, I'm gonna have to do a new share because I didn't share my whole screen.
Dr. Myers.
Yeah.
If we're friends with other individuals from the class, would you like us to partner and do it, or it's just something we could do individually?
This is something you're gonna do individually, but we will partner on Wednesday in class. So good question. But yeah, just self-report ones, which we're gonna talk about today. But really good.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks for asking. But yeah, if you want to do them with a partner and like compare scores, certainly feel free. And I'll go over this much more on Wednesday, but essentially I tried to get ones that got at different theories we'll discuss throughout the semester. So they're not all just from trait theory. So you've got some stuff from like the flow skills, existentialism, self-actualization is humanism. You've got the sentence completion test we talked about on Friday. There's your psychodynamic. And then we have a values one, and that's sort of what we're going to call third wave. So we'll talk about that. And then the self-esteem one is really a trait one. So again, I tried to get at a whole bunch of different ones. So yeah, do those before class. They shouldn't take you very long, probably 10 minutes or so. If you're really thoughtful, maybe 20. But I encourage you, don't overthink them. Just go ahead and work through them and give honest answers. So, and like I said, I sent out the email, so anyone who's not here will hopefully see that and complete them before class. And then in class, I will like show you more of the materials for things, and then have you partner up to do some things there as well. And there will also be an assignment that you will get credit for. And thanks to those of you who reshared your assignment with me. I don't know if I just like accidentally deleted it. I'm going to put that up to user error, but I very much appreciate those of you who were like, but we turned it in and resent it. So thank you for assignment 2. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you're good. I didn't accidentally delete your groups apparently. So thanks for sticking with me there. Alrighty, any questions about anything coming up? So by Wednesday, I will try to brush up your review sheet because, believe it or not, your first exam is coming up in the next weeks here. And so you will have access to that in plenty of time. And we will also have some time in class the day before to talk about it as well. So your next exam is a week, or your first exam is a week. And remember, that's 2 parts. The take-home part is already on Blackboard, so if you wanted to start working on that, you could. It's a bunch of short answer questions, essentially, and make sure you're answering each one. And then the in-class portion, which I still have to sort of like figure out the logistics if I'm going to do that. I might like put you each in your own breakout rooms so you're not distracted by the other people, and then you can come back to the main part if you have a question. Maybe we'll try that. But it'll be multiple choice and some very short answer. And I always put extra credit on my in-class parts too. So you'll have opportunities for that as well. So again, we'll talk about that much more over the next few days, but just sort of giving you a heads up so it's on your radar. Start looking over the take home to see if you have any questions for me. And I will be glad to answer those in the coming days. So for Wednesday, just do the questionnaires, no reading in the pieces book or anything. And then we will do lecture Friday, discussion Monday, exam the following Wednesday. So here we go. The semester is really getting into swing now. Okie dokie. Any questions about anything I just said or the class in general? Awesome. Alrighty, well then I'm gonna get ready to go back into our lecture here. So give me time to do my scene change. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull up our PowerPoints, get it ready to go, and then share it with y'all. And as per usual, if you have questions, either unmute yourself and be like, hey, Dr. Myers, or you can type them in the chat. So I'm gonna go ahead and share our screen here. And we're picking up at personality inventories, just to remind you where we were. And I'm just gonna make sure that my chat is visible in case anyone does ask questions. All right, so this is a completely different type of test. It's called the personality inventory, and it's designed to measure broad personality characteristics. And so this is going to be a more overarching way of looking at personality than some of the things that you will take for Wednesday for your little sample. These are typically quite long. They focus on beliefs, behaviors, and feelings, and they're usually based on self-report responses, and oftentimes they're like a Scantron, like you used to do the SAT and all that good stuff, or they are now often done on the computer. And some of them are even adaptive. So if you answer like one question one way, it doesn't need to give you the other questions. So that's something else that is important to know. So really, if we're doing any kind of clinical practice, especially if we're going to be doing anything for court, for example, you should only give standardized personality inventories. The ones that you see like on BuzzFeed and things like that, those are fun, but obviously they're not going to like be admissible in court, right? So that's something important to know and remember. Alrighty, so the one that I know the best, the one that I got a lot of training in grad school, is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI. On an exam, I would never ask you to come up with the whole thing. You could just write MMPI and you would be fine. So it consists of 567 self-statements, or at least the original did. I'll talk to you about some of the revisions as we go through. And An individual is to respond to each item by saying it is either true as it applies to them, false as it applies to them, or they cannot say or they don't know whether or not it applies to them. And in this case, they just leave the item blank. Now, you can't have too many cannot says or you can't score it, but typically people only have a couple of these. So some sample items from the MMPI are, I would rather win than lose in a game. I am never happier than when alone. My hardest battles are with myself. It has a series of different scales. So the clinical scales assess both symptoms of disorders like depression and also personality traits like introversion, extroversion. Traditionally, these scales were basically you scored high, that meant something. In more recent revisions of the MMPI, a lot more of the scales sort of both ends mean something. Like if you're really low scoring, it means something as well. There's also validity scales, and these are scales that are built in. They're not separate. The items are scattered throughout the 567 that assess basically how well someone is taking the test. So it assesses things like careless responding. So they're essentially like two versions of the same question, and do they answer them the same way? It measures things like whether you are trying to lie, whether that's to lie to make yourself look good or lie to make yourself look bad. So why would people do that? Well, you might lie to make yourself look good if you were filling this out for, say, a custody battle and you wanted to get custody of your child. And in fact, that happens so much that there's a separate interpretation for child custody cases on the fake good scale. You might also fake bad or exaggerate your symptoms as a cry for help, saying like, I really need to get care, please, please help me. And again, it doesn't even have to be conscious, it's just how you end up responding to these things. Some places that you see the MMPI discussed, it will say scores over 65 are considered high or clinically significant. Some places will say 70. I was taught 65. There are like competing methods, and some say 60, some say 70. Psychology is a weird world, just like anywhere else. Like this actually plays into our simulation we'll do at the end of the semester, so I'll give this a little quick side note. So I was trained by Jack Graham. You'll see him on a couple slides. And he has a book about MMPI interpretation. And then while I was on my residency, we did an MMPI workshop with Green, who is another big MMPI name who has his own book that he sells about MMPI interpretation. And it was really funny because I was actually sitting next to him at this lunch afterwards. And I was like, oh yeah, I worked with Jack Graham, I'm from Kent State, I was trained. And he just like turned away and didn't talk to me the rest of the lunch. So psychology can be just as political as anything else over the weirdest things. I was like, okay, there we go. Some other sample items, again, just to give you a feel. I'm sure I get a raw deal from life. Evil spirits possess me at times. No one knows it, but I've tried to kill myself. Most people make friends because friends are likely useful to them. And obviously some of these we pay more attention to than others. When we gave this in our training clinic, if our client endorsed the suicidality items, we were notified immediately before we got the rest of the scores so that we could either catch them before they left the clinic or contact them right away. So this is what the score result, or what's called a profile, looks like. And this is a simplified version. In fact, the MMPI profile actually has several other types of scales, so you would have pages of graphs like this. So we're gonna start over here, and I'll try to use the mouse to show you where I'm talking about here. So over here, this block before the line is the validity scales. And so what you can see is they didn't do any cannot say, they didn't leave any blank, so that's good, that makes it easy. I was trained by Martin Selbaum, who was a postdoc at the time and is now a professor, I believe he's now in Australia. He was at Mississippi for a while. And he told us if they score more than 30 on the cannot say, you should just fold it into a paper airplane and throw it in the trash because you can't do anything with it. Really, we would shred it for confidentiality. But essentially, there are certain things that make it uninterpretable, and that's one. This client, in this case, not a problem. And then if you look at the other validity scales, none of them are above 65, so this person is responding in an honest way. Now I'm gonna do just like a thumbnail quick interpretation for you based on what's going on over here. And here again, you see where there's a 70 cutoff that's being interpreted, and I was taught the 65. So I'm gonna interpret based on the 65. So he may be experiencing physical complaints that are perhaps psychological in nature, since scales 1 and 3 are high. And now the really interesting thing about these scales is that they are given, the MMPI was developed in the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 40s. And so some of the names of these scales are just old terms for things. So these scales are hypochondriasis and hysteria. And it's essentially physicalizing your psychological problems. Then there is that he's definitely depressed. Depression is the highest score here, right? Really high up there. He also seems to be experiencing anxiety, as evidenced by his high score on scale 7 here. And that score is the psychesthesia scale, which is, again, just an old word for anxiety. Scale 8 is also high. Now, the scale 8 is called the schizophrenia scale, but when you're at this height, it doesn't mean that you're actually schizophrenic or even psychotic. What it typically means is that the person's experiencing confusion, which is actually pretty common with something like depression or anxiety. In order to be looking at a diagnosis of psychosis, it would need to be like way up above 100. And then finally, we can also look at scale 0. Scale 0 is the social introversion scale, and because he's peaking here, it means that he is introverted, shy. Now, the really interesting thing is that this scale ends up being related to depression in the original MMPI, so it could also just be sort of residual from that. So again, thumbnail sketch of how these things go. So the MMPI was developed using a method called empirical keying. And typically I would write these terms on the board as I go, but what I'll do is just type them in the chat as I go so you all have them. So empirical keying is kind of a weird method, and it's essentially you do it based on your results rather than sort of assuming things beforehand. So in order to do this, the first thing you do is gather lots of items. Okay. And these are from many different places. They're often from previous tests, and maybe ironically, now a lot of them would be taken from the MMPI. But essentially, you gather a lot of questions or statements, or sometimes they're even single words to have them. The next thing you do is administer the items to people who are already divided into groups. So for example, for the schizophrenia scale we just talked about, they had a group of people who were already diagnosed with schizophrenia take it, as well as a group who was their control group who didn't have schizophrenia. So then they compare the answers of the people with schizophrenia to the answers of people in the control group who are assumed not to have schizophrenia. So then you compare the answers, and essentially the items that people with schizophrenia respond positively to, but people without schizophrenia don't, become the items that go on to your schizophrenia scale. It's like these are items that people with schizophrenia are endorsing, but people who don't have this disorder are not. And test makers do not care what the content of the items actually is. So for example, one of the original designers of the MMPI used to brag that he had never read all the items. Like he just didn't care. I think that's a weird flex, but you know, whatever works for him. Then what you do is called cross-validation. Oops. I'm actually in the chat and not just typing into the oblivion. Okay, so cross-validation is used to predict behavior, diagnoses, or category, maybe something like a personality trait, in new samples. So basically what you would do then is take your schizophrenia scale and give it to a sample that's mixed between people who have schizophrenia and who don't. If it succeeds, that is, if the items on that schizophrenia scale actually differentiate between the two groups, then it's great. You now have a schizophrenia scale. If not, then what you would do, you would repeat this process and you would re-hone the items to make them more accurate. So again, sort of a weird method, but the idea is it's entirely empirically based. It's entirely based on research. So there's not any sort of researcher bias going into it. There are some big problems with the original sample. So I mentioned that the control group was supposed to be non-pathological. Well, the control group were actually friendly.
By my drawers.
Savannah, did you have a question?
I'll be able to let you know.
So the control group were family members and friends visiting these patients in the hospital. So all the patients in these groups were actually hospitalized for their illness. So the problem with this is we know that many of these conditions are genetic, right? And perhaps even if someone wasn't diagnosed with, say, depression, they might still have experienced it in the past or even have symptoms then, just not bad enough to be hospitalized. So it's not as clean as they originally thought or wanted it to be. The other major problem with the original sample, it's since been rectified, is that they were all from Minnesota, okay? So there's a definite geographical bias, a huge ethnic bias, right? At that time, people from Minnesota were pretty much all white, and they were pretty much all of Scandinavian descent. Okay, so that's not giving you very much diversity at all, obviously. It could be missing some really important things. So as we got more knowledgeable about things like representation, the psychologists who were using this recognized it was really problematic. So in 1989, the MMPI-2 was published, and it had a much better sample with new norms. And really the primary goal of making the two was it was called the Restandardization Project. Again, acknowledging they needed a better sample. And then there were new items introduced. So they created a new set of scales called the content scales. And they also removed some items that existed where the language was now offensive, might have been offensive originally, or ones that were illegal to ask in a job interview because the MMPI is often given for job interviews for really high stress positions. So for example, if you go to become a firefighter or a police person, they might give you the MMPI. And then in 2008, the MMPI-2RF, which is restructured format, was published. And actually just this year, I don't even have it on this slide yet, the MMPI-3 was published. So, you know, you have big gaps in between these things, 10, 12 years, you know, almost 20 in the case of the 2 to the 2RF. So the 2RF was based on research, but in a different way than the empirical keying that was first used. So it was based on what were called the restructured clinical scales. So essentially, a lot of researchers started to look at the scales and realize, like, if you're high on one of the clinical scales, you tended to be high on several others, as we saw in our sample. And so they did what's called a factor analysis, where you kind of look at the data and see what's going on. And what they found is, because of the empirical keying, these scales actually shared items. And those shared items were actually just measuring demoralization, just feeling kind of crummy, right? Which, if you have a mental health diagnosis, you probably are, right? So what they did for the restructured clinical scales is they created this, they took those items and they put them on a demoralization scale of its own. The RCD became this demoralization scale. And that left you with much cleaner clinical scales. The 2RF is shorter. I think the 3 is shorter yet. I need to actually take a workshop on the 3 because I haven't had a chance yet. And so the 2RF was only 338 items instead of the 567. And they made sure there were no overlapping items at all at each level of interpretation. And a lot of good research came out of that. And the 3 just essentially takes the 2RF and gives it an even more representative sample. So my impression is the revision from the 2RF to the 3 is really similar from the revision of the original to the 2. All right, so I keep mentioning these guys, so I thought I'd throw up their pictures here. So while I was at Kent State University, which is the KSU here, doing my PhD, I got the privilege, really, of studying the MMPI under Jack Graham and Yossi Ben-Porath. So Yosef goes by Yossi. And they were both clinical faculty, and they served on the committee that revised the MMPI into the MMPI-2, Jack in particular. And then Yossi is one of the lead authors of both the MMPI-2RF and the MMPI-3. So he's a huge name in the MMPI research now, which is one of the reasons why Kent State is so highly ranked in terms of assessment training. And Jack is retired now, but they both did a lot of research. Yossi still continues to do research on this. As I mentioned before, Jack wrote one of the interpretive guides for the MMPI. The interesting thing is that's now almost obsolete, because with the 2RF and the 3, the interpretation is actually included in the materials you get when you order the test, which is really nice. So new thing, new helpful thing. I got to have both of these guys supervise me when I did assessment reports, which is also really cool. So like I remember I had a client who had an eating disorder, but also a lot of other issues, like she was using cocaine heavily and whatnot. And so we had this research system where they take the MMPI before our first therapy session, and then we wouldn't get our results till after we'd had 3 sessions with them. And I think it was her 3rd session, so like right before I sat down with Jack to look at this report, that she just sort of like blew up at me. And I was explaining, like, here's what we do for therapy for an eating disorder. We have you monitor your food intake, and we look for patterns, and then we start to change them. And she just started screaming at me. She was like, monitor? You want me to monitor my food? And like this went on for an entire session, like to the point that afterwards people were like, are you okay? Because they could hear me through the therapy room walls. And so I told Jack about this as we sat down with her MMPI results, and he was like, I don't see that at all in here. I understand why you were caught off guard, because this is not showing up on her MMPI at all. I thought I'd like just missed something. But it was really cool to see, again, this expert in the field be like, no, you didn't miss anything. Like, she's good at hiding stuff. It was also really cool because we were one of the first ones to get training in the 2RF, because Yossi was one of our professors. And Jack was not involved in the development of the 2RF, but he came to that first workshop. So he was asking Yossi questions about the 2RF from his like wealth of knowledge about the MMPI. So we all learned a lot just from Jack being in that session. Alrighty, but the MMPI is not the only game in town. So the other thing is the Personality Assessment Inventory, or the PAI, which has 344 items. So more similar in length to the 2RF or the 3 for the MMPI. And the participants answer false, slightly true, mainly true, or very true. So again, remember the MMPI is just true, false, or you leave it blank. Here it's more of a Likert scale. So false, slightly true, mainly true, or very true. It also has validity scales, just like the MMPI. It has clinical scales. It has treatment consideration scales. So it kind of says, okay, if you are seeing this person, here's some things that might be helpful to you. And there are also 2 interpersonal scales. Now the PAI was developed using what's called the rational method. And this is where items that seem to measure what the researcher wants to measure directly, obviously, and rationally are what are put on these scales. It's described by the PAI test creators as being developed conceptually. So if you remember back to when we were talking about face validity, that's essentially what they're doing here. Do these items look like they measure what we want them to be measuring? So the PAI is used pretty extensively in the VA. In fact, it's actually integrated with their online records keeping system. So it's actually pretty easy to get your results and have them go right into the chart. And here are just some sample items. People are afraid of my temper. People once close to me have let me down. And I can talk my way out of just about anything. So here's an example of what a PAI profile looks like. And it looks sort of similar to the MMPI, except you see this blue line up above, and that's what they call the skyline. So the really interesting thing is you see there are interpretive lines, again here above 70 or below 50 are interpreted. But you also compare to a sample, and you get to choose as the clinician what's the appropriate sample to compare to. So there's samples for like outpatients, people who are just coming to your office for therapy. There are samples for inpatients, so people who are so severe. Yes, I will repeat the rational method. So the rational method is just, do these items look like they're measuring what they're supposed to be measuring? Basically, if you just look at the items and be like, that measures depression. We're asking if they're sad. And again, it's not a bad way to do it, it's just different than empirical keying or some of the other ways we're going to talk about. Yeah, really great question. So you choose the skyline, and then you compare your client to similar clients, essentially. And here you can see this is the only sample PAI I could find online when I first created these slides. And this person doesn't really have anything they're peaking on, so it's kind of a boring profile. But there are also times where this is what you get, right? And that's okay. So that's good to know that, you know, not everyone you get is going to be peaking on a whole bunch of stuff. Especially if you're working in more of like a counseling setting where you might be seeing people more for like phase of life issues rather than very severe psychopathology. Alrighty, so now we're going to talk about the 16PF, or the 16 personality factor questionnaire. This was developed by Cattell, and we'll talk about him more when we talk about trait theory later in the semester. So he derived the 16PF based on words and statements describing personality. It has 185 items. There are 16 primary personality scales, hence the 16PF, right? But there are also 5 global personality scales. So example item, when I find myself in a boring situation, I usually tune out and daydream about other things. So the 16PF was developed by an even different method. So it was developed using factor analysis. And so this is a statistical method, there we go, for detecting order amidst chaos. So you find groups of things, and in this case, items on the 16PF, that are alike statistically. You take a whole bunch of items, you administer them to a whole bunch of participants, and then you put them into your stats program, and it says, hey, these items seem to be grouping together, and the separate group of items seem to be grouping together, and that's how you make your scales, is essentially what the statistics tell you. Oftentimes when you hear someone who's a statistician talk about factor analysis, they'll talk about whether the items hang together. That's the language they use. I'm not really sure why. But essentially, are they grouped together statistically? And if so, that becomes your scale. Here's an example of what the 16PF profile looks like. Now, very distinct from the other ones, you'll notice that this has anchors on both sides. So both are meaningful and clearly meaningful. So, you know, something like extroversion, introversion, right? Both sides matter. It's not one or the other. Whereas interestingly, like the introversion scale in the MMPI, you're like in the pathological range if you're high on introversion, which is really weird to me because like introversion in and of itself isn't pathological, obviously. So sort of interesting ways of conceptualizing these things. All right, the next thing we're going to start talking about are the types of questionnaires that you are going to fill out for Wednesday. So again, these are posted on Blackboard, the ones that you have to fill out for Wednesday, and do fill them out before we come so that we have time to discuss them. So these are, again, completed by the individual, and rather than these giant, wide-ranging scales like the MMPI, the PAI, the 16PF, these are very focused. They focus on one specific area of functioning. So it could be affective. That's just a fancy psych way of saying mood. So something like a scale that only measures depression. It could be looking at a behavior like social skills, how they behave in a social situation. And it could be cognitive, looking at their thoughts, their assumptions, or, you know, how they think about something in particular. So one of the most widely used self-report inventories, not only for research, but also for clinical work, is the Beck Depression Inventory. This is developed by Aaron Beck and his colleagues. He is just like a giant in the field of therapy. He's in his 90s and doesn't know how to retire. He's doing like cutting edge research on talk therapy for schizophrenia right now. So he developed this scale, and it's a little different than other scales you might be used to. Essentially, instead of it being like disagree to agree, it's every item has statements, and you pick the one that matches best with you. So for example, for the suicidal idea, this one, I don't have any thoughts of killing myself, all the way to I would kill myself if I had the chance. I really like the BDI because it gets at things beyond what we typically think of as the symptoms of depression. So if we go to diagnose someone, there's some pretty clear-cut things in the DSM, but it leaves out a big chunk of what the experience is like for someone with depression. So I really like this one about work inhibition, right? Is your depression getting in the way of your work? That's a genuinely important question for your client, right? And I really like that they include loss of libido. You know, one of the things that happens when you're depressed is you just lose interest in sex. And not only is that going to be problematic for you, but probably for your partner if you're in a romantic relationship, right? And so I really like that those are included as well. The Beck is short. It's 21 items. It's like a page front and back. It takes people less than 5 minutes to fill out. And so not only is this used, like I mentioned, for research, but oftentimes if you're treating someone with depression, you would give this to them before every therapy session. And you would see essentially how they progress as you go on. And it's very gratifying to actually see their numbers go down. And in the type of therapy I'm trained in, cognitive behavioral therapy, you actually graph it for the client so they can also see it going down. All right, as technology has improved, psychology has embraced that and started working interdisciplinarily with other professions to use these for research as well as for diagnosis. So neurology is actually a subfield of medicine. So people with MDs practice neurology. And it involves directly studying the brain. So neurology is directly studying the brain. So neurological tests measure brain structure and activity. So an example is the EEG, or electroencephalogram, which is when you see this little baby with up in the corner. I always think like, well, why were they doing an EEG on a baby? Like, I'd love to know the backstory on this picture. But essentially it just detects your brain waves and it gives you a readout like you see on your left side of the slide here. So you actually just see brain waves, and it kind of looks like the output of an EKG, which is what they do for your heart, right? But it's for your brain. So it gives you a lot of interesting information about essentially your brain's activity, but it doesn't exactly tell you where in the brain there might be a problem with brain's activity. In order to do that, you need to do what's called neuroimaging. And neuroimaging involves taking pictures of the brain. And it can be a still, like an X-ray, or it can be essentially like a little, you know, MP4 clip, or even like a GIF, however you want to say it, that's taken while a person performs a task. So you can actually see parts of the brain activating, which is really cool. One thing that people often get confused with is that because I talk about these in class, they assume psychologists can do these. No. So if you needed a client to get neuroimaging or to get neurological tests, you would refer them and have them go to a hospital. Often neuroimaging is really actually going to be done by a radiologist, right? Someone who specializes in doing these types of assessments. Or, you know, a neurologist will probably interpret it. The psychologists typically aren't given the training to do this. And so we will refer and again, work in these interdisciplinary ways. So one of the types of imaging is the CT or CAT scan. It's called computerized axial tomography. And it basically uses x-rays of the brain taken at different angles. And so anytime you see something that's either really bright white or really dark where it shouldn't be dark, that's problematic. So here you see this dark spot here. That's actually a bleed into the brain. And this little bright white spot there is likely where, say, the stroke occurred. These sort of things that kind of look like, I don't even know, cucumbers, curvy cucumbers. Those are called the vesicles, and everyone has those in our brains. They help with balancing cerebrospinal fluid and just like our balance. So those are normal, but this splotch is not. Then there's MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging. And this uses the magnetic properties of certain atoms in the brain to create a detailed picture of the brain. It's higher resolution, and so you think, well, there's a huge advantage. Why wouldn't you just do this on everyone? Well, there's a big disadvantage. It's just that because it's magnetic, you can't do this if the person has any metal in their body. So if you have a pacemaker, if you have, you know, a knee replacement that's made of certain metals, things along those lines. So you can't do an MRI if someone comes in and unconscious and you don't have any like family member to tell you those things. There was a dramatic example on House where they like tore a bullet out of someone's body with this. It's not that dramatic. I've actually talked to people who do these scans, but it will actually move it around. Right, and anytime you have something moving around in tissue that's not supposed to move around, it's going to be problematic. So, little fun fact about MRI, it won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2003. Then there's the PET scan, or positron emission tomography. I would never have you guys write out these long names. The abbreviations are fine. These are computerized motion pictures of chemical activity throughout the brain. It uses antimatter in its reading. It's very sci-fi. It's very cool. And this and what's called functional MRI are the two ways that you look at what the brain is doing while someone does a task, for example. And so the images on the middle of your screen here are actually looking at a cocaine user. and when they're on and off drugs. And so literally you see this is your brain and this is your brain on drugs. I don't know if anyone else remembers those old school frying pan commercials, but those were always on when I was growing up. So it shows that people who are using cocaine, their brain actually isn't as active. All right, the way that psychologists are involved in neurology is for a subfield called neuropsychology. It's a neuropsychological tests are where we test people's abilities to see where the damage in functioning has occurred. So we're not looking at the brain to see, oh, there's a tumor here. We're looking at what can't they do, basically. And that helps us to figure things out. So we look for damage in cognitive, perceptual, motor areas. So for cognitive, we might do intelligence tests like the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or WAIS, that I mentioned on Friday. Again, this is carefully standardized, and you compare it to other standardization scores. It's really considered the gold standard for assessing intelligence. For perceptual, you might look at things like the brief visual memory test, where you have people copy images, and can they copy it? Or sometimes what happens if you have damage just on one side of your brain, you might only copy like half the image, because it's like you're almost not seeing the other half. And, you know, motor things, there might be something like the groove pegboard, which is where you actually have these little pegs that can only go in one way, and the person has to manipulate them, and you time them to see how long it takes. So you have them do it with both dominant and non-dominant hand, and it's a challenge. I not only gave it, but we always had to do the tests ourselves when we were learning them. Other ways that we can assess people is through observation. So this is a way to directly examine behavior. So naturalistic observation, clinicians observe clients in the everyday environment. The most common ways that we do this are like kids in the classroom. So school psychologists in particular might do this. Analog observation is where we observe them in some sort of artificial setting. So this is the image you see here where they're looking through the one-way mirror and observing people. And the other way we do it probably most often is what's called self-monitoring. So the clients monitor themselves. So back when I was doing therapy, this was often pieces of paper. We would have the person take home and fill out their homework throughout the week. It might be the food log I mentioned earlier. It might be things about their thoughts. Nowadays, more and more, these are done on apps. And so there will be a therapy app that asks them to fill out the same information, but it's right there. And there might even be an alarm that goes off to remind them to fill it out. So it makes it much easier for the client because they don't have to like carry around these separate sheets of paper. It's right there on their phone. It also makes the data easily accessible to both the client and the therapist. So now that we know all about clinical assessment and how we do personality in psychology, it's important to note there are major differences between these types of assessments and assessments in the popular media, which we're confronted with every day. So here are some examples. We want to look at the difference between psychological assessment, which is well-validated, good reliability, based on research or theory. And then popular assessment is usually not any of these things, right? It's like a writer at a magazine or a website came up with it. So for the next couple slides, I have some examples here of items from both popular and psychological. What I'll have you all do is use your reactions. So let me do this so I can see you all. So if you think that it is psychological, so something that could be used in research or clinical work, then you can use your thumbs up reaction. It should be right at the bottom of your screen. If you think it's popular, you can use your clap reaction. So this is if you're making a pillow for your dream word, which fabric would you make it out of? So clap is popular, you'd find this in a magazine. Thumbs up is, this is in psychology. I'm seeing mix here. Some claps, some thumbs ups. Yeah, looks like mostly claps. Yeah, this is popular. I think this came out of like 17 magazine, something along those lines that I looked at when I was originally designing these slides. All right, how about this top one? I feel like I get a raw deal from life. Thumbs up is psych, clap is popular. Yep, lots of thumbs ups. Yeah, and I kind of like gave you guys this one. You know, this is on the MMPI. I gave it as an example earlier, so good. This is dated. I just realized, like, no one carries a G-Shock or a PDA or an iPod anymore. So clearly, this one is not psychological or standardized. This one's from the popular press back in the early 2000s when I first put this together. Woohoo! I'm old, not really that old, but. All right, how about how many days per week on average during the past 6 months have you eaten an unusually large amount of food? So again, thumbs up is psych, claps is popular. Yeah, everyone's getting that this is psych, awesome. So this is from something called the Eating Disorder Diagnostic Scale. That's a self-report questionnaire that basically goes along the eating disorder symptoms in the DSM. And again, I showed you the loss of libido one from the BDI, so you know that one. How about this one? Who was Martin Luther King Jr.? Thumbs up is psych, claps is popular. And some people aren't sure, and that's okay. This, believe it or not, is from a psychological exam. This is from a subtest called Information on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the WAIS. So this is an example where there are some cultural biases, right? Because it asks about things like that you might only know if you went to certain school systems, right, in America. And then this last one here, we think it's popular or sorry, psych or popular. Let me not switch it on you guys. Psych or popular. Yeah, mix here again. So this is actually from a online intelligence test. And certainly there's probably something like this on a psych test somewhere, but it wasn't actually drawn directly from a psych test. So hopefully that was interesting to y'all and something that'll help as you think about these things. And again, fill out your questionnaires for Wednesday. That's all you have to do to prep for Wednesday, no reading. So everyone have a good day.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Dr. Myers, can I ask you a question about the take-home test?
Of course.
So with the take-home, do we like when we like format it? I didn't really look too far into it, but I just like I pulled up the rubric. Does it have to be like an essay, or do you want us to like?
No. And in fact, I'm thinking of going in and like making that more clear. Because I actually prefer you to just like put the question
one and then type two. Okay.
Yeah, I think what I'll do is make it more a list of questions, and then I'll make that more obvious. So thanks for
Okay, yeah. Just wanted to make sure I didn't know.
Yeah, thanks for checking. I appreciate it.
All right, happy Labor Day.
Thanks. Yeah, happy Labor Day.
So I probably am going to schedule a meeting with you to talk about this because I got nominated for the National Society of Leadership and Success. And it says that you are the co-advisor.
I am, yeah.
So yeah, I'm probably going to schedule a meeting with you just to ask some questions about it.
Sure. And actually, the president, Naila, will probably even know more than I will. And she's super nice. So if you shoot her an email, she'd definitely be willing to chat with you about it.
Awesome.
She's also a psych major, so.
Yay, awesome. All right. Well,
congrats.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm pretty excited about it. Happy Labor Day. See you later.
Bye.